Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here with us for the 5th episode of the Not a Classroom podcast. We're up on Spotify now, so check us out there. That's pretty exciting. This is a bit of a longer episode with my friend Jess, where we talk about psychology and mental health and quite a bit about therapy. We also get a little bit into the stresses of trying to get into grad school and the GRE and a few other things. But yeah, since it's a little longer today, I'm just going to give you a quick quote. This is from Joe Wong, the guy who makes the music for a really good show called The Midnight Gospel. It's not reasonable to have a goal of making something great because you can't control that, but you can set a goal of being ready for something great to come to you. Not really sure exactly how to feel about that one, but I like thinking about it a lot, and I think it's interesting. So anyways, here's the show. Hope you enjoy. All right. So, hello, Jess.
Hi.
If you want to get us started today on our episode here by telling me a little bit about yourself, and I want the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want everything.
Okay. I'm gonna say on my drive over here, I was thinking about, I know it's the first question. I was thinking about the question, tell me about yourself, and just the fact that whenever somebody asks you to tell you about yourself, it's always like there's a specific reason and they want specific information, right? Like at a job interview where it's like you have to tell them, yeah, like you're selling yourself. Mm-hmm. And same, like when you meet somebody new, like you're meeting someone like when you're climbing or something, it's like, oh, tell me about yourself. It's going to be related to the activity that you're doing. Mm-hmm. And so the question, like, tell me about yourself as an open-ending question with like no obligations at all, I think is a really interesting question, and a question people maybe should think about.
I think that was a good little story description for how you think about things, but
yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I don't know, I guess I grew up in Oregon. It's a very basic start off. But I think growing up in Oregon really helped me to have a cool relationship with outdoorsy nature things. I grew up not really doing any computer games or video games or like TV type of thing. So I grew up very involved in wanting to be outside and wanting to spend time outside and having a positive relationship with that. And then, so I would say a big part of me is happy, positive relationship with being outdoors. And then another thing I think is music. I started playing the bass in 4th grade, which was really cool. And I think a story that really tells a lot about myself too was when I was in 4th grade. Actually, when I was in 3rd grade, I think it was 3rd grade, I got pneumonia and I lost a lot of weight. And I was already, 4th grader. I don't know, you weigh 50 pounds or whatever. But I lost 20 pounds when I got pneumonia. And so I was super, super, super tiny, right?
Oh, Jesus. And you're playing bass.
Yeah, exactly. So my mom told me and all of my siblings that we had to pick an instrument that we wanted to play. And it had to be an orchestra, so it had to be violin, cello, viola, or bass. And so I went in and they had I don't know, the school had some sort of setup or something where they had all the instruments laid out. And you got to go and kind of look at them and play with them and be like, oh, do I want to play this or not? And I walked immediately up to the bass and I thought it was just the coolest instrument. It was super cool. It was super big. And I was like, oh, I really want to play this instrument, right? And this lady was like, you are so tiny. This is unrealistic. Your fingers are really tiny. Maybe violin or something else would be better. And I, put my 5th or 4th grade, sassy pants on and said the equivalent of, bitch, please. And then I played the bass. And that's how I decided I wanted to play, the upright bass. And, it's something that was a huge part of my life. And it still is.
I just want to say you definitely alphaed me more than in 4th grade, because I remember they told me my hands were too small to play cello, and I was like, okay, I'll play viola.
Yeah, no, I have a big dick energy as a 4th grader. I was not okay with being told no. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, and I think, another cool experience I had that I think had a really influential like impact on my life in ways that I hadn't really thought about. You know, I was in like 6th grade or something like that, and you know, I was playing bass, and there's this like really cool dude who's like, you know, top dog of the music department of like Oregon. His name was like it was Carl Roshkis. I don't know if I said his last name right, but you know, whatever. This really cool dude. And he came in and he was like watching our like middle school class like play instruments, right? And he reached out to my teacher and he's like, wow, like this kid is so cool. Like, is she in private lessons? Like, I see so much potential in this kid. I'm like, first of all, I don't know like what potential you saw, like me like fucking up like Ode to Joy. like I don't really know, like, yeah, but I don't know. And I thought that was a really cool experience. And then he offered to pay for like private lessons for a year for me.
Damn.
Which was crazy, you know, because like that wasn't an opportunity I ever would have had. And like just this random dude saw like a lot of potential in me. I think that was the first time that I had someone ever like, oh, like I see potential in you and like do something about it, or like try to like offer to like, you know, help or like encourage like development in a way. So I think that was like a very like, I don't know, rewarding is the right word, but it was a really cool experience.
Yeah.
And it was something that I really enjoyed. And I was, even at that age, like I immediately used music kind of as like an outlet in my life, you know, for, you know, whatever reason. And it's just like I can play and like, I don't like the word escape, but, you know, kind of like an escape or like a, you know, it's like an outlet.
Escapes can be good.
Yeah. And then, you know, I continued to do music throughout high school, and I love music. It's super fun. I remember I was in a bunch of music groups, and I just, I don't know, it was just like all I was focused on all the time was playing music. And it was, if I had anything in life that was like challenging going on, it's just like I would just like play and play and play. And it was probably unhealthy relationship, honestly. Like, just like you play so much music and it's just like you're ignoring other things and not like processing things that are probably important to like, you know, process.
You and bass were a little too close.
We were a little too close. That's for sure. But I spent, you know, hours and hours and hours practicing. And it was, I don't know, a very cool, I feel like developmentally, music was like helped me throughout development, which is kind of a weird thing. Like, I don't know.
It's funny because I feel like I keep learning about all these musicians that like, because I'm relatively into like listening to music now. I don't really play anything anymore, but it seems like there's a lot of musicians that I enjoy that have these stories of like growing up where they were learning to play. And then they kind of just write off everything else. And they're like, fuck it, this is what I'm going to do. I don't really care about most of these other things. And they kind of just, I mean, I guess I wouldn't call it unhealthy. I think it's just something you really like doing.
Yeah.
I guess if it's blocking out other stuff, maybe not.
Yeah, no, that poses a really cool question. Are musicians unhealthy when they use it 100% as their outlet? I don't know. But
I don't know. I think having one thing as your only outlet is probably dangerous. But
yeah, I mean, and also like, you know, suppressing how you're feeling and ignoring it. And I think there's a lot to be said about, you know, not processing things. But yeah, so...
But you moved on to learn about people not processing things in college.
Did. Yeah, and I think, another interesting thing too, though, that I didn't realize that happened was my senior year of high school. I found out like I had a pretty significant reading disability.
Yeah.
Which made sense. Like growing up, I was really bad at school. Like I was not good. I was always in like the lowest reading groups, and I was always the kid who like, you know, I don't know if you experienced this, but like whenever you're reading in a classroom and you have to like, you go like sentence to sentence where you like everyone reads like a sentence or a paragraph. I would like count how many sentences or like how many paragraphs there were until it was my turn based off the kids in front of me.
Oh, wow.
I would like rehearse like what was said in that paragraph because I knew I was going to mess it up because I was so bad at reading. Oh, and also I probably had really bad anxiety about reading.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah. And so like, you know, had, a significant reading disability that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And found out that because of my instrument, it like actually significantly, like I retrained my brain, like how to read in a different way. And like reading music notes, like significantly helped me with that.
Oh, damn.
And because I was doing it so often, like I actually like improved and like, made it easier for me to be able to like read in general, which is actually really crazy how like transferable like reading music notes was over to just like reading in general. But
I'm sure there's a lot of like pattern recognition and stuff in there, but I guess I'd like to move on to I did love this story.
Yeah.
I think that was really good. Probably a very exciting intro, but so you've learned some things about psychology in college, and I'm sure that probably helps you reflect on some of these experiences and what you've had with music and how you've could have been blocking certain things out, but then also maybe how it's helped you in various different ways. But what have you focused on in school with that?
Yeah. So I definitely didn't start as a psychology major.
Yeah.
I had a lot of experiment through different majors. And I think psychology is such a cool field because it's applicable to everything.
Yeah.
Right? Like anything you can think of, there's psychology in it. So like engineering, there's like humanistic psychology or like developmental psychology or clinical.
You almost got me to do that.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, no, like there's so many cool fields. And so I think, what really caught my attention with psychology was how many things there are within the field. And it took me a while, but once I realized like my options are endless, like how cool is that? I really wanted to do psychology at that point because I didn't have to choose right then what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, which, left me problems later. But I think it was really, it's really, I don't know the right word, like appealing, it's something very
broad
interesting.
Spectrum and the lots to learn, I think that's something I'm always looking for.
And I think that's another part talking about learning is that in psychology, it's a field that is never ending. There are so many fields, there's so many things to learn about, and there's like endless things to learn. And that's something I'm like, for the rest of my life, like I really want to just like learn things. But as for like my specific interest, like in psychology, those have also been ever, developing.
Yeah.
And initially I became really interested in, adverse childhood experiences, which is under the age of 18. There's a list of 10 items, like trauma items that people experience, such as like divorce or also things on, more heavier subject like sexual assault and things like that. And for example, people who have 4 or more on average will die 20 years earlier, or they will, there's so many things that they develop or like are at risk to, like health wise and like mental health wise as well.
Yeah.
Like more likely to be sexually assaulted, and like there's so many different categories, and that was extremely interesting to me. And then another thing I became really interested in was biomarkers. I read this paper on ADHD research. I became obsessed with ADHD and biomarkers, but a biomarker is like being able to like physically identify something that is essentially like showing that you have, X, Y, or Z. So it's like, I'm trying to think of a good example of biomarker. So for example, this study was trying to look at finding a biomarker for ADHD. So finding a physical measurable item that can allow researchers to know like, oh, this person has ADHD. And they did like a research study using EEG and found that people who have activation and right alpha symmetry, which is like a section, like a measurement, like are more likely to have ADHD, or like they have more symptoms of ADHD, right? And so, something like that I became really interested in. And it's like, understanding actual physical markers that help people to like know, oh, do I have a disability? And then other things such as how does trauma impact development? And then how can we help people who have trauma? And how can we help them become resilient, or how can we come up with like interventions for people who experience those things?
Is there kind of a debate going on there between which one of those is the, not necessarily the factor, but like has a larger role, like trauma versus biomarkers within?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely comes down to the nature nurture debate. Yeah, which is, is the way you are raised, or the like physical attributes that you are like born with have a bigger influence. And like, I think overall, and I think it is more generally accepted, like both are very, very much contribute into like, how you develop as a human. But yeah, there's somewhat of a debate there going on for sure.
And you're saying with this, sort of within this trauma section, or I forget what you said, like early developmental trauma or something along those lines, that you're saying people will die 20 years earlier on average because of these things. Is it, is it like normally, is it associated with, is that being pulled down by like suicides, or is it just various different things? It sounds like it could be.
I'm under the impression that it's different things, but that's actually, I didn't look into how they died 20 years earlier. But I do know that it has a significant impact on health. So I'm assuming health plays a major factor in that. Yeah. But it also has a major factor on mental health. So I would assume it's a combination of both.
Yeah. Well, like I always feel like when people talk about trauma, like I don't know, I'm sure everybody's experience with trauma is very unique, but then you end up with, I'm sure there are probably situations where like, I guess the thing that's always portrayed in the movies is like somebody who like has something happen that's out of their control is like sort of kind of struggles to find that in some areas. And that's different for every person. I think a lot of people can end up in situations where things are out of their control, but I think there's probably developmental things that can form that, this is me just kind of spitballing, but I feel like things that could form that would maybe be patterns that might not necessarily be the best, that could lead to health issues down the road. But.
Yeah. And I mean, when you think about trauma, like if you ask people who have experienced trauma, I think a lot of people don't remember a lot of things that happened during the time that a traumatic event was going on. And that's not always the case. But when you're so focused in on your trauma and challenging life experiences, you're missing out on developmental stages of your life. You're developing, your brain's developing until you're 25, and you're experiencing trauma. You're going to be focusing on, how am I going to eat food tonight? Instead of, who am I going to invite to my birthday party?
Yeah.
You're focusing on different questions. You're focusing on, I need to take care of my mom. I need to take care of my siblings, or, things that like at that age, generally people aren't having to deal with.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, definitely like there's a lot of gaps in like, developmental periods that if you experience trauma, you just may miss out on, or not fully develop in certain areas and aspects. But
yeah, I think I would imagine, the thing I'm imagining is just the patterns that you develop for dealing with stress. That I don't know if this is true. You're the psychology guru here, but I've heard that dealing with stress, I at some point in one of my psychology classes, or maybe in my health class, we talk about how like dealing with cortisol, just how if you're constantly stressed out, that can lead to like serious negative health effects. But there's maybe, I don't know if this is true, but there's like sort of different types of stress. Like there's stress that you feel like you can manage versus stress that just feels unmanageable. And it's stress that feels like that can be managed, at least in moderation, is maybe not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. But the constant stress might not be so good. But
yeah, you're getting into a topic I don't know a ton about, but positive stress is a thing for sure, and negative stress. So like positive stress, like it has a name, and I don't think it's just positive stress.
It's like positive psychology. I don't know.
Yeah, but like having X amount of levels of stress, but different types of stress than the feelings you experience when you're like negatively stressed, has a different effect on, you know, your mood, your life, and a whole bunch of things. And I think stress, I think that's a tricky, but yeah, there is definitely, I'm trying to think of an example of positive stress, and I can't think of one off the top of my head.
I don't know. We don't have to get too far into it.
Yeah.
I think thinking of things that reduce your stress, you're talking about music. Something that you've told me you're interested somewhat in like music therapy and stuff. And I guess do you know what happens to people when they listen to music, like cognitively? Like, is there something there that, because I know that I feel like sometimes when I listen to music, I can get myself into like completely different headspaces, especially depending on what I'm listening to. Like weirdly enough, like I'll listen to like classical music if I want to study, but then at other times I could listen to like metal music while I study, and it's surprisingly good.
Yeah.
Or if I want to like write, maybe I'll listen to something that's, I guess, would try to make me more introspective or something. But I don't know. Is there something there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more there that I also don't know about.
You're very humble.
But I think generally, and also like, to be fair, I don't know a ton about music therapy, and this is like, you know, my outlook on it is, one, I think music maybe be able to be used in a state where maybe not like meditation, but almost like, you know, like kind of this like other state where it's like you're focusing on something else, or you're focusing on it, like, I don't know, I'm doing a hand motion, but like, like becoming part of your body, or like, you know, merging with you. And then I think another aspect is like finding things that make you happy, right? Like, my rule of thumb is every day I need to do something that makes me happy. And like, if like, if I had a hard day at work, or if I already had a good day, it's just like, I really need to find something that makes me happy. And when you think of music, like, I don't really know people who don't like it. And so this actually kind of brings me to this idea that I had a while ago, where I really wanted to create like this program where people would use like music therapy or wilderness therapy, or, you know, XYZ, like art therapy. Like, there's so many different types of things, and then add other things into that, you know, like at one point in my life, I was really interested in car mechanics. And so I was like, oh, like some sort of like, you know, like Lego, or like building things, and just like being able to implement like your hobbies and what you enjoy into things. And like, while talking about things, like, I feel like it can be really beneficial. Especially like if it generally just like makes you happy. Like, I feel like it's just like, you know, not a bad thing. So
I think that one of the burning questions I've been wanting to ask you for a while is, do you think there's more to humans than just biology? And I think the thing that I'm thinking about with that now is, I guess there's probably something going on in our brains that makes us specifically like music. I have fuck all idea where that came from. I guess I heard this come up in a conversation I had like a month or so ago, and it was just an interesting concept to me, because it seems so almost like detached, almost like very stoic and kind of non-spiritual or whatever. But yeah. No, that's a good question. I think that humans are definitely, you know, 100% like more biology. Like, we are biology, but it's what we do with that biology, and that can lead into like, you know, spiritual aspects and other aspects based off of that. So yeah, I think sometimes when I think about like, how the hell did we end up getting to a certain point where we're like, this specific sound in this song sounds really cool, and I really like this, and it's just there's got to be some crazy shit going in our brains for that to work out the way it does. But I think that's sort of it. Like, I'm not really a religious person, but I think sometimes I end up thinking really a lot about like our consciousness and our conscious experience. But then I think about like psychology and just trying to separate science from how people experience their reality. But I think something I think about with therapy is, do you think that spirituality or even certain religious ideas should be involved there in psychology? Because there's probably potential for that to help certain people, but I don't know exactly.
Yeah. I have a lot of different thoughts that go off of what you just said. One is kind of going off topic, but one, as
okay.
I have a friend who's in a grad program, he wants to be a therapist, and something that he's learning is different religions. And that is for the purpose of being able to address people and having a good understanding of their own personal belief system and their own values. So I think in that sense, combination of therapy and religion is you have to be able to, if you're a therapist, you have to be able to respect people's religions, their upbringing, and kind of try to have an understanding of how it has an influence on their life, right?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. And then another aspect to that is more something that I'm interested in, which would be, leaning towards philosophical psychology.
Yeah.
And me personally, I'm really interested. If I ever did therapy, I don't know if I'll, go that route. I'm definitely interested more in the research side of things. But existentialism therapy is something I think is really cool. And that's more where you are looking at, I'll give an example for reference. I took an existentialism class, in college, and our teacher made us download an app that reminded us that we were going to die every single day. And so you wake up and there's this notification, just a reminder, you're going to die, right? But that is that really is the idea in existential therapy, where it's being reminded, your existence is temporal. You're not going to live forever. You're not here forever. You need to live every day it's your best. And I think that's really where I kind of had that idea to implement, I want to do something that makes me happy every single day, because I'm going to die. We're all going to die. We're not here that long. We're just little tiny dots on this huge ass earth, and so kind of implementing that into therapy, I think is a really cool idea.
I think I'm sort of looping here, that the app reminds me of, I think I said this at some point on one of the other episodes, but talking about, I forget who did the quote, but it's the best time to plant a tree or something is 100 years ago. And but the next best time is now. And so I guess there's potentially a motivating factor in being told that you're going to die every day. That's actually something really that I found really interesting with looking at philosophy. I really like absurdism, like Camus and the myth of Sisyphus, and I should reread that again. It's really not that long, but yeah, it's absurdism is very similar to existentialism for those who don't know. But it's in a lot of existentialist philosophy, it's some things are about creating your own meaning, but in absurdism, that's seen as a pitfall, and that it's more about, it's kind of this weird thing that is absurdism has this whole deal where it's kind of, it almost feels like circular logic, because it's saying you should accept that the world and your reality is meaningless, but you should continuously rebel against that fact. And it's just which is absurd, because in a way that's it's not meaning, but it's something, I guess. And the example is the Greek character Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, and then in Camus' version of the story, he says that when the boulder rolls back down the hill every day, you should essentially imagine him smiling, walking down the hill to roll it back up the next day, which I always thought that was super, for some reason I thought that was super cool, because I'm probably a weirdo, but I think that idea, sometimes it can be scary to think about, but then at other times it's this idea that if I think about it, it's oh, well, whatever I do is, sometimes if I think about something being pointless, I can just do it. Because I'm well, what matters? I don't know. Whatever. I'm just going to do this anyways because it's this idea of, I don't know. I don't usually like contextualize my actions behind like absurdism or anything. It's not that complicated, but I don't know. I think using philosophy as a motivator is interesting, but I think, I guess within existentialism or existentialism philosophy, is that more about dealing with existentialism, or is it about, I guess, seeing the world through that lens as like a tool? It could probably both.
I think it's both. Yeah. I think it's definitely both. Also thinking about the rock.
The rock.
The rock. Yeah. No, it reminds me of a really cool book that I read. That is I think it's, I don't know, some sort of like, it's like plain simple Buddhism. I don't know, some like easy like Buddhism, like intro to Buddhism book that I read. And I actually, there's a really cool story, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't remember it, but I'm going to give just like the general idea, and I'm going to not get the words right at all, but I'll get the idea through. So there's a man, and let's say his son broke his leg, right?
Yeah.
And his neighbor came over and he's like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Your son broke his leg. That's horrible. I'm so sorry for you." And he's like, "Well, like, it's neither good or bad, right?" Mm-hmm. And, the neighbors were like, "What the fuck? Like, this fucking broken leg." But the next day, the army comes to recruit people, and his son has a fucking broken leg, and so he can't get recruited. And so then he doesn't get recruited because, broken leg. Neighbor comes over. "Congratulations. Your son didn't get recruited for the army," And the same dude, the dad goes, "Well, it's neither good or bad," And the story goes on. There's a whole series of events that happen where it's like, well, it's neither good or bad. And like, I feel like that can be a really dangerous or a positive thing to look at. Yeah. But like when I applied to grad school, and well, this brings up so many like thoughts all at once, but like, sorry, I'm thinking of so many different like things now. I just keep track of my thoughts. So like when applying to grad school, it was like, okay, well, I'm going to apply, and clinical psychology program is extremely competitive. Yeah. Unlikely you're going to get in. You usually need 3 years of research experience after graduating with a bachelor's degree. And I did look at it kind of with that perspective, and kind of this outlook of like, well, like, and at the point, like, everything happens for a reason. It's neither good or bad, like that type of outlook. And so like, I wasn't bummed or upset when I, didn't get accepted. I mean, it sucked, and it was like a grueling process, and I was obviously like somewhat upset, but I didn't let it upset me as much as I think I probably should have. Like I was very like
Stoic about it.
Yeah. But then this also brings up another point that I was thinking about, is the idea that everything happens for a reason. That's a fucked up idea. That is not true. That is not fucking true. And this reminds me of that. I don't know if you like, people listening have seen BoJack, the episode of Diane where she is trying to write her like play script.
Oh, is it was she in Vietnam for it?
No, she's in Chicago, and she's trying to like write up her play script.
Okay. And
it's just like, she's trying to write this like really traumatic, like life experience story that's like, oh, my life fucking sucked, right? Like, like here's all these bad things. And like, she wants to help people with this story. But then she writes like this, like kids, like, or like a high school or like play story instead. And she's doing that instead. And then like, she just goes spiraling down, and she's like, well, like, that means if I can't make something out of like, make this story about all of these traumatic experiences that happened to me into something that people can benefit from, then it happened for no reason. Yeah. And then she's just like spiraling out of control, where it's like, all these shitty things happened to me, and like, I have to write this story. I have to like use it as a way to help other people. And then it brings up that idea. And I think that's such a cool,
a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And like, I think that that's such a interesting topic just to think about, like, and like, I think that so many people get under this impression, like everything happens for a reason. It's like, no, like things happen. It doesn't mean it happened for a reason. I don't know. Maybe it did, you know, I don't know. But this idea that traumatic things happen for a reason, some people experience so much fucking trauma. I'm like, there's no way that all of those things happen for a reason. Like, and you know, experiencing really challenging things is hard. And it's like people who experience those things are always trying to find a story out of it. And I don't think it's good to I don't know the right word. Just like tell them like, I don't know, you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, like disconnect or just that's kind of a scapegoat saying that. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember. There's some line that might not be from that episode in BoJack, but Diane says something about in one of the episodes says something about like for so long like you feel like you're the main character in the movie. Mm-hmm. And then you realize that I'm butchering the quote, but it's like something about realizing that you're not in a movie. Yeah. And that this is just what's happening. Mm-hmm. And like, I think that sort of fits in with that. Just I think that a realization like that can be a really hard thing to sort of go. I don't know if I'd call that like an ego death or maybe like, not an ego death, but like maybe related in a way, but the idea that I guess being realizing your insignificance in a way. I think that's something I think with the existentialism therapy that like sometimes I think about that and then just like I don't know, sometimes I feel like I waver a lot in how I think about things. Like I obviously have good days and bad days, but then like some days you're going to like look back and just be like, wow, my life has just been a fucking mess of like bullshit. And then you're like, look at all these bad things that have happened. And then on other days you're like, well, if this bad thing didn't happen, then I wouldn't have done this and like experienced this. And like you realize these patterns, but then it's also like, I think even thinking about it in that way can kind of, you maybe start to associate like or at least in the past, like I've maybe had this happen where I like would start to associate like, oh, this wouldn't have happened without this. But I really like there was some quote I saw somewhere about just the study of history, how there's no counterfactuals, like how if this had happened, then this would have happened. It's like, well, we don't actually have any fucking idea what would happen if certain decisions change, which I think is like why I think it's an interesting perspective to have on looking at regret of certain things. Cause I certainly I could analyze so many points of my life that I think I could have made better decisions, but obviously there's nothing you can do about that. And I think that's why I sometimes like the kind of the absurdism or like the Buddhist story or whatever that you told is just kind of taking things for what they are and seeing where you can go from there. Yeah. I think those are kind of the ideas that I think within therapy that can be really helpful, but maybe aren't necessarily always at least said in that way, in the traditional way. Like I think to get us back on that a little bit, I kind of think about this idea of how much therapy can help people. And I mean, there's obviously very different types of I think cognitive behavioral therapy and like dialectic behavioral therapy and all these different things. But I don't know, is there some level of introspection or spirituality in there as well? I'm not really sure, but yeah, I guess. Do you think everybody should be in therapy?
That's a good question. Okay. Generally, I would say yes. I think everyone could benefit from being in therapy. Mm-hmm. However, for therapy to actually work, the therapist and the client both have to believe it's going to work. Yeah. That is how you know if a therapy session, there's some percentage of efficiency or whatever, but it's that is the relationship. If the client is goes to a therapist, and that there's a lot to be said about that too. If I go to a therapist as a I don't know, say I am a African-American woman going to a white man from the Midwest, right? Mm-hmm. you have cultural differences, sexual differences, so many other differences that are unaccounted for. And it's like, as a woman who is African American, do I think that this relationship and like this person can truly like understand me? Like, are they going to be able to help me? And that's something that is, tricky. Because if like there is this doubt and that kind of this like cover of belief, like, oh, like I really don't think this is going to work, then it probably won't. So not saying, and there are ways to address that as therapists, right? Like you very openly, and like, I'm not a therapist. I've just learned about these things. I have a lot to learn in clinical psychology as a whole. But you learn you immediately want to address that on your first therapy session, which honestly, like, I don't know if that's super common practice in a lot of fields, like in social work and, other just like mental health, like therapist type, like different types of therapy, right? I don't know if it's always addressed, but like usually you want to initially like address that and be like, oh, like clearly we have differences. And as a therapist, like here's what I want to do to address those differences, right? And like here I put effort into learning these things, or like I will try my best to try to understand, but like I will not understand fully your experiences.
Yeah. That's interesting with the religious stuff you were talking about earlier, because like as well, because I think that I'd never thought about that because I'm not really religious, but now that I think about it, it's just the way people's belief systems can affect how they deal with things is probably just orders of magnitude and differences. I guess there's no objective scale of that, but yeah. And so, if either of those people don't believe that therapy is going to be effective, then it won't. And as a society, I'm thinking Carver saying we live in a society right now. Do we live in a society?
We live in a society. What was I saying? As a society, there in the past particularly was a really negative stereotype around therapy. Yeah. And still today, there's, a negative stereotype. Like you go to therapy if you need fixed. And I don't like that term fixed. Yeah. So people who are going to therapy, I don't think people are going to want to go to therapy even just to work on general things unless they like, and this is generalizing, some people who are in that mindset, right? And think that therapy is only if you're broken. And they're like, I'm not broken, right? And like, we're all broken. Like,
I was going to say.
Like everyone, like we're humans, right? Like we live so many experiences, no matter your own personal lived experiences. You have gone through things that like would be beneficial to talk through with people. Yeah. And like, honestly, and I've thought about this, I'm like, if I ever had kids, I think it would be so cool. And this is another cool idea that I had, but I think it would be so cool to have like your kids in therapy at a young age, because it gives them an adult to trust that's not you, somebody to talk to, showing them that it's okay to be vulnerable to trusted people, and learning how to express their emotions and learning how to talk about things. Yeah. And that brings up a whole other rant. I don't know if I should go off on it or not.
No, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I can't remember if I ranted about this too. But I thought it'd be really cool.
It might have been me.
Yeah, probably.
It might have been me.
Yeah. But this whole system of how mental health is horrible, for so many people. And there's not really good sources or outlets for people. And particularly thinking of young children, it's like to prevent bullying, to prevent suicide, to prevent so many things. I think a really cool, expensive though system would be to start therapy when you're like in kindergarten and have somebody that you check in with, and then have a therapist all the way up until you're done with high school. And there are so many things that could be covered in therapy. And it's like, you don't even see it. You can see them every couple of months, but it allows you somebody to talk to. So for example, if you're being sexually assaulted at home and you have nobody to talk to except your parent that is sexually assaulting you, how like if you trust a person because you grow up knowing them, they might be able to tell that something's off, and they might be able to implement and help you. They might be able to realize that you're not getting, enough food at home, and they might be able to address that issue. Like they might be able to realize so many things. And eventually, when you're in high school and maybe, if somebody were to have suicidal ideation, you have a trusted person that's not at home and not a family member that you can talk to.
Yeah.
Like, it's just such a good way to help mental health, to help like catch sexual assault, and just generally to help kids develop.
Yeah.
And like, I don't even think it would need to be like a full therapy session. I think having, as long as the person who is the therapist is a good person, you know, having a trusted adult who can be trustworthy and who you've known forever, be a figure in your life that you can talk to, who is not a and not a parent, because like so many people don't even talk to their parents about things, you know, like I don't particularly talk to my parents about things, right? Like I don't think a lot of people do. I think, you know, some do, but like your parents not a therapist, you know. I think it's very beneficial to like have an actual person to talk through things as you develop as a human. You learn how to process emotions. You learn how to do so many things and skills that I don't think we generally, you know, don't learn in school, don't learn, period.
Yeah.
So
I think that's something I've been thinking about recently. You're talking about talking to your parents about stuff, and just how when I'm talking to people about like certain serious things, I've been trying to be aware of people's perspective of me on certain things and my relationship to them, and how that could affect how they take my advice. Because that's like,
I just want to say that is awesome. That's a lot.
I'm not great
I think
at
that's
it.
also a lot of like, also not saying it's overthinking, but that's a lot of effort to go into a normal conversation. And that's really cool that you are so like considerate of.
I'm not that good at it.
But that's cool.
Well, it's like, it's something about when I think about therapists and like my experiences in it, is just it's like having an objective voice in therapy is like, or seemingly objective. It can even be hard to feel like that sometimes, because in therapy, you're always presenting your case on things, but it does feel different to have somebody who is not really involved in the rest of your life. Like, I think on the school thing though, like, I think it almost felt like I've had experiences where I've had, like, I mean, there's an element of they're trying to do it with counselors, but it's just not the same. It's not presented how we're talking about it. I think this the economics part of my brain is screaming at me, because I would love it, but I don't think it's really feasible.
It's not.
And
it's not at all feasible.
This brings me into your gripe with Caleb and I's discussion. We talked for a moment about therapy bots and stuff, where I that's such an interesting area to get into now, because I think kids are being exposed to technology now at a younger age. And so now I'm starting to wonder if we're talking about this dynamic of the therapist and the therapy, the patient, Jesus Christ.
I like therapy.
We're talking about them having like a trust in the situation. I wonder if maybe we could find something to benefit out of children being exposed to technology at a younger age, and how maybe they could find more trust in like something like a therapy bot. But I don't know. I think maybe that technology is getting better. It would be really cool if it was, especially considering the state of healthcare in the US, and then also just how I wanted to bring this up. There's this TED Talk that I watched ages ago, just talking about this guy, like, feels like we're like in the Middle Ages when it comes to how we treat mental health. Like, not because people aren't putting in immense amounts of effort, but because it's incredibly difficult to treat mental health. Like, you get certain diseases, or like you break your leg, you get surgery, like your wrists have holes in them, Jess. You get surgery for it. But mental health, it's like, it could be years and you're like not, I guess, quote unquote, treated or something. Like, it's 5 years down the road, you still have depression. Like they're like, you mix medication and therapy, and we try to do all these, and it's just, I guess that it almost feels like, I mean, obviously society is talking a lot more about mental health, but it's just this existential kind of thing that it's like, there's not really, it doesn't feel like there's an objective way to treat things, especially considering like, I guess, how confusing differences between like extended grief and like depression and various different things could be, or like how you could be launched into various different mental health, mental illnesses. It's kind of daunting, but I don't know. Maybe our therapy pots are the way, Jess. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I really do think, especially with a, newer generation being like super interconnected, like with technology, like very involved. I mean, as long as they truly believe that therapy is going to help them, maybe. But the other aspect is there's not the other side of that, where it's the counselor is thinking that it's going to help them.
Yeah.
Except that's like, the developers of the app, right? Or whatever. So it's like, I think I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing to have. I think it could be beneficial. I don't think there's a ton of there's not drawbacks to it, but I do definitely think that there's a lot of benefits to having like a personal connection also with a human, right? Like, especially with suicidality, particularly, I think having a close relationship with a human being is really significant. Sometimes all you need is somebody just to say it's okay, So
let's get everybody on Discord, baby.
Yeah.
Join those chat rooms. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, but you do bring up a really interesting point, which makes me think of so like how psychology, like how therapists will diagnose disorders is using like this big book, right? It's called the DSM-5.
Yeah.
And it has all of these disorders with a bunch of criteria. And if you meet X criteria, then you have X disability. So how did they come up with this, you ask? Oh. Initially, it was a group of, I think they were all old, like, men. I think they were all men. Maybe there was a woman on the committee, but they all got together.
Wow, one woman?
Maybe. I honestly don't even think that. I don't even think that there was, but I'm pretty sure they're all white as well. We can fact check this. I'm very curious. But anyways, get together in a group and they go through and they start coming up with ideas like, what are symptoms for X disability, right? And like at some point someone's like, I don't know what disability it was looking at, but it's like, oh, well, I have those symptoms and I don't have that, so that shouldn't go in there. Oh. So like they created a very general guide of figuring out like symptoms or like criteria for X disabilities, but like it was so I don't know, like personalized, and they're like, well, if I don't have the symptoms, then, or like if I have the symptoms, then they shouldn't be included in that symptom, or it's just so outdated. And we've come a long way from there, but we're still like, I think mental health field I think is still really far behind like physical health field, because even there's low inter-rater reliability, even with like people being diagnosed at one clinic. They might be diagnosed with something, they go to a different clinic, it might be something else, because there's so many symptoms that overlap with each other. Often it's really hard to tell. It's I'm in a sleep lab right now, and it's like that's a really big thing that we're thinking about is like do they primarily have insomnia, or is the insomnia coming from their depression? Yeah. And same with like, do they first primarily have anxiety or ADHD? And like, which one do you focus on, right? And so there's so many different like things that can be combined, and so many different symptoms that overlap. So even within... And
there's always like a spectrum of things as well.
Yeah. And like, that's an interesting thing. Like,
it's like 4D chess, but with...
Yeah.
this.
Like with depression, for example, like one symptom is like you are excessively sleepy all the time, or like don't sleep at all. And that's like, how is that possible that that's in the same like criteria, right? Yeah. And so it's insane how much variability there is, even from trained health professionals, and going from one clinic to another, because it's all based off of X book and you're making X judgment. So I don't know. Yeah. There's a lot to be learned, and that's why I think research is so important, that we can really determine things and like help people to the best of our ability, and continue to develop the mental health field closer. I don't know if closer was like accurate at all, but like get it caught up with physical health field. Yeah. But that's hard too, because
they're very different.
They're very different. Yeah. And it's like, we're not fixing you. That's not the point, you know?
Yeah.
But it's like we do want to be able to address problems and like help people to the best of our ability. And I mean, we're pretty good, right? But there's always like, you know, development that needs to be done and research that needs to be done to continue to improve that.
I think that gets into a topic that I think about a lot sometimes, is just how do we define what it sometimes feels like the definition of what depression is has become not necessarily loose, but it's it can be really hard to understand what is depression and what is like sadness or dealing with certain things. And I've heard definitions of like what clinical depression is, but then it also gets confusing where it feels like, oh, like you can have bouts of like depression that are recurring. And then I also forget, I feel like I heard somewhere that like if you go through a certain number of recurring bouts of depression, it's a lot harder to get out of that. Like if it's like a once a year thing, it just kind of comes around, like seasonal depression. I think could possibly, I don't know if that was the specific example, but it seems like something that is I wouldn't say necessarily overdiagnosed or anything, but it's hard. Like I would say yes and no probably, but it's seems like something that is, even for myself, hard to understand if I'm just really anxious and that just leads me to certain spots sometimes, or if it's interconnected with certain types of depression or yeah.
I like the way you addressed that question too, or like that statement as well, because and this is, you know, for example, we'll use bipolar because I think that's a good example. Being like, oh, she's so bipolar, right? Mm-hmm. You hear people say that.
Yeah.
And that's throwing around the terms like mood changes like that. That is not like, you know, that's what people are saying, like, oh, she's moody, right? And like, that's not what bipolar means at all, period. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at too with depression, is it's kind of like, you know, I'm so depressed, and it's like, yes, I'm sad, and like they may, you know, physically or not physically, like mentally, right? And like you may have depression, but people are using like terms like that to describe like, oh, I'm very depressed. And I think it's tricky. Like labeling is something that I think is pretty controversial too. I don't know if I'm going way off topic here, but like for example, I'll go with like, you know, autism. Like I did a internship at OHSU, and they say you always use person first language. So it's always person with autism. You never say like autistic person, which is really interesting, because then when you look to a lot of people within the autistic community, they're like, no, I am an autistic person. I'm not a person with autism. And it's really like, I'm using this, like this is something that defines me as a person. And like they want it to be like that. And, you know, and I think it's always important to like directly ask the person how they would want their disability to be addressed, because people vary so much. But like, you know, I think it's really tricky to, I don't really know the point I'm getting at here. I kind of lost track of my like in thought, but like basically I think it's really tricky with like official diagnosis too, because like a lot of people are like, you can be treated for symptoms of depression without being diagnosed with depression. Yeah. And a lot of therapists will do that, where they're like, oh, like I don't need to treat or like actually define my clients with a disability. I can just treat for symptoms. Yeah. And so then that's like, you know, being labeled as depression or autistic, or being like having this official label, which can either be positive or negative, and that depends on the person, right? It's very person dependent. Is, I don't know, like a really, I think a heavy would be the right word. It's like a heavy thing, right?
Yeah. I think I would imagine that shifts. Like I would say I'm an anxious person, but I would also I don't think I've thought about it too hard, but I like for me personally, but I could understand how that would be a complex situation for someone to like, if they would associate something with, associate that disability or illness with themselves. It brings up a question that I've thought about in the therapy context, is like, I think this is sort of one of the burning questions for me is, like, let's say I have depression and I'm in therapy, is like, at what point am I not depressed anymore? Or like, at what point do I no longer have depression? Like, like we've discussed how it's not about fixing people. It's like we're doing treatment and somebody is being treated, but I guess that's kind of like the nebulous question as well, is that it's like, I guess you could have recurring mental illnesses, or you could have a situation where, like, because I imagine if you're like, I mean, from my experience, you're not going into therapy and getting DSM tested every single day, like to see, do you still have depression? Because you're going to have like up days and stuff, but it's a confusing scenario, I guess, because then you're like, I guess you maybe start to question, do you ever have this? Did I ever have this? Was it just a brief moment, or like because then there's also situations where like I guess we're talking like neurochemically. I guess depression would be defined in that context as like the biological thing going on is there's a chemical imbalance in your brain, and that's like where it gets really confusing, because as far as I understand, I'm pretty sure brains are very adaptable. So like or like maybe not adaptable, but like I'm sure there's certain events in your life that could change your brain chemistry to a certain point, or like even getting a concussion like can throw you.
Yep. That's for sure. No, I think that is such a cool question. I was going to bring up the point about depression, but you already brought it up. I was going to say, like, definitely it's on a biological level as well. But like, for instance, I know for bipolar, if you're diagnosed with, I think like, bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, it's like you're diagnosed with that for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Like that is like clinically you're diagnosed with that period, which is, very interesting. And then like with, depression, for example, it's like, you go to therapy because you clinically have depression, or say biologically, like say they did a study, and I don't think they'd ever do this, but they did a study and they found that you do have a chemical imbalance in your brain and you need more serotonin, right?
Yeah.
And so you go to therapy, right? So there's, I think, 2 ways. It's like one, medication, and, you can take serotonin, you can increase the chemical, the serotonin in your brain and your receptors, whatever goes on in there. And then your serotonin increases. And then does that completely fix it?
Yeah.
And then the other way, say you don't do therapy or you don't take any medication and you're just going to therapy, which, perhaps, and this is a very controversial topic, may be the more healthy way to address depression, especially initially. Mm-hmm. Are you getting enough serotonin? Like, are you getting serotonin from this appointment? Like what, like on a biological, like level, like what is being addressed in your brain, right? But it's taking key skills from therapy, learning how to apply them in your life, learning how to use these skills to, I don't know if fight is the right word, but, fight with depression, like really use skills and techniques that you learn to help you. But then on the medical level, where it's like you're taking medicine, it just like physically can change your chemical imbalance, know?
Well, I think it makes me think about what, as a society, we think of therapy and the use of mental health drugs, and how I sometimes think that there's a misperception around therapy. And I think therapy is, at least to me, it seems like it's a tool for gaining skills to understand how to deal with complications and like your mental illness or disability. And I think that I guess it can be misconstrued in some ways for some people. And I think it's also just so weird because you see sometimes, have you ever run into someone that you feel like is just happy like all the time, and you don't really understand, like, I don't know, it's like, I guess you don't see into that person's life necessarily, but sometimes it feels like you're like, okay, I don't like, maybe that person is talking to someone I don't know about stuff, but like, I guess it comes back a little bit to like philosophical psychology to me, where it's like sometimes I talked to Katie a little bit about this in like our first episode, where having like a revelation about something, and then like sometimes I feel like I get frustrated because I won't like follow through on something, but it almost feels like I'm not always the biggest fan of like positive psychology and like the just around that being trying to use positive. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but just using positivity essentially to kind of alleviate certain things. But like sometimes you're like, man, maybe if I just committed to like fully into this philosophy of like, I'm just going to go with the flow and like let things be and be happy with stuff, like it could work. But it's like, it doesn't. And then there's other people who will just like completely shut everything out. And I don't know. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it feels like, I don't know. Sometimes I think with, it makes me question if therapy would work for some people, or if it's, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if therapy should be able to work for everyone. But I think that you run into this, I wouldn't say issue, but it feels like there's sort of this, it just feels like there's a misunderstanding of what maybe therapy is for sometimes, but not necessarily all the time, but maybe with some people. I mean, I've certainly encountered people, but but I guess, I did have a question about so I understand why a patient would have to believe in therapy. That makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. What would it mean for a therapist to not believe that the treatment was going to work? Like, what would that even look like?
Yeah. So, definitely dependent on the therapist, and it could be for any reason. Like, let's say you're my therapist, and say I'm just like, dude, I fucking hate everyone who's religious, right? And say you're super religious, right?
Yeah.
And I'm over here and I'm just completely bashing on religious people. Maybe that could be it. Maybe. And we have to remember, like, our therapists are humans. I actually read a book that kind of addresses this. This is a very good insight into therapy or actual people. But this dude who's a therapist was seeing this extremely, extremely like obese lady, right?
Yeah.
And he was just like, had so many negative thoughts. And he was like talking about this, and he's like, dude, I couldn't see past, like, she was, and he, just kind of sounded like a rude dude from this, but he's a human or whatever, but he's just like, I couldn't see past, like, she is just like so fat, and like, he's being really rude, and he's being very honest in this book that he wrote, and I don't remember what the book was called, but just talking about like, he had a hard time, like, initially focusing on the therapy session because he was, he grew up in a fat phobic family, and he was fat phobic himself, and like, had all of these tendencies, and like, then it made it very difficult for him to pay attention and to like actually do the therapy and do his job because of his own personal issues. Right.
Yeah.
And that's another big thing is like, I think it's probably, I'd say a general belief that, therapists need to have had therapy.
Don't you? I thought you had to go to therapy in like clinical psychology school or something. I could be wrong on that, but
honestly, I'm not positive. Like maybe in like counseling psychology or something.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
But like in clinical psychology, I'm unsure. But
okay, yeah. I think counseling psychology would be.
Yeah. Well, it depends. There's so many like types of different programs. Like a PsyD is all therapy, but like clinical is like research. But you also learn therapy. But I could see it maybe in like a PsyD program. But honestly, I have no idea. Like maybe. But there is like, you do like, if you have your own problems, you have your own issues, and you're thinking through those things while you're doing therapy with somebody. Like if you have too much of a like hurt or like a connection to this client, that's like negative, or, you know, it's an issue that you're working through yourself and you don't think you can give advice on it, or, you know, there's so many reasons. Like that book, I thought was just really interesting, thinking like, oh, this dude is just straight up fat phobic and just can't work with this client because she's fat. And he worked through it, and he like, I think he told her, and like at the end, like addressed it to her, and she's like, yeah, I know. Like I could tell. And like, but you know, he got better at it. But yeah, I think that's like a good example where it's like you have your own individual differences, or you have your own prejudices towards somebody, because therapists are humans. And even though I wish that people weren't prejudiced, like, you know, they are. So
I don't know if this will come off like kind of Machiavellian, but like, could you not as a therapist just like lie or like, would it work in a situation where like, I guess to lie in a weird roundabout way, if you were lying about like, or like basically putting on a performance for like your quote unquote duty of sorts as a therapist, in a way you do actually kind of believe that it's going to work, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. Because
so like lying about
like let's say this person, take the fat phobic person, he just kind of puts on an act for like a certain period of time, and is like, I don't believe that this is going to work for this person, but I'm going to say things like it will. Why would you, I guess, do that without the intent? Like, I don't know that you could you actually do that without believing that it could work I guess you could believe the whole time that it won't work, but then like maybe it does.
Yeah.
But like at the end of the day, like what would be the point in continuing that if you didn't have at least some belief that it would?
Yeah, and I think in his case, it was because he had a belief that he would get better at it. Like, he would get better at therapy, right? And so, like, I think you could say, like, oh, I think this is a good fit, even though you don't. And you could, like, continue to do therapy and use your skills, and it might benefit them. But I still think that unless you truly think, like, I think I can help this person, like, I personally wouldn't think there would be a point in... I mean, you would want to recommend them to somebody else, but that's also, you know, it's like you don't want to go to therapy and immediately get sent to somebody else. So I think as a therapist, you probably also are always really, really, really trying to like want to help people, right? Just generally, like you're a therapist, like I would assume, like that's like you really want to help people in general. And so I think it would probably be less like not more, maybe more rare is a good word, like more rare for some, like a therapist to be like, I really don't think this is gonna work. Like there has to be like a definite reason why the therapist thinks that it's not gonna work, right? So I guess I'm thinking a little bit more in the ethics area now, but the I don't know if you'd know this, you're not like a PsyD or anything, but are there times where a therapist should lie to their client? Like, I do not know. I would assume. That's a really confusing situation to me. But. You know, when I first heard, I don't know why this came to mind. When I first like heard about like this like high school teacher that I had. Actually, she was my middle school teacher, and then she went to my high school, and I don't know. I came across her at some point, and I was like, oh, like I'm gonna be. You know, I'm going into psychology, and, you know, general assumption is like, if you're going into psychology, you want to be a therapist. And she's like, oh yeah. And then she like straightly told me like, oh yeah, like, you know, like I worked as like a behavior, whatever person for a really long time. And like, I do think that lying to people to like manipulate them and make them feel good is like a good thing, as long as like if you're helping them, like, and she said it like in that phrasing. And really? I was just like, I've never heard someone explain psychology like that, like lying to people to manipulate them to think they're doing better. And I was just a very strange like interaction. And I was just like, oh yeah, like, okay. Like I didn't really know how to respond to that, but like, you know, like her impression of psychology is something that I think probably a lot of people have. And I am curious because like, I genuinely like, you know, I don't know, like, I don't think that there would be any reason you would lie to your client. Like I can't think of a specific like thing you would lie about. I could understand like a safety situation maybe, but I feel like
I always have to be careful in political arguments and psychological arguments. I think with this, where I think if you're to lie in a situation to make someone happy, that's kind of that's a pretty moral gray area to get into, because that to me feels like it's like a dictatorship almost, where not necessarily let me think, like I guess a dictatorship, like authoritarian situation where I guess the example I would use is like Russia, like early 1900s Russia with like a vanguard intellectual party. It's like assuming that they know the best, like they know what is best, and that moving into this, like it's a situation where you would have to assume that you are in a better mental state to understand what is best for this person to do an action like that, which I think that's probably a really important ethical question within therapy, because there's probably situations where you kind of have to assume that, because if you don't assume that, it's like maybe you shouldn't be therapizing this person, I guess. But
yeah, and I'm just, I'm having a hard time thinking of like an exact example, like when a therapist would lie. But like, generally, it also depends on the type of therapy. Like I'm trying to think, like humanistic therapy, right? Like your client is going to be like mostly just talking, and then you're kind of like, addressing, and like you help them solve their own problems, right? Yeah. And then different types of therapy, it's like you give them, feedback to what they said. And so it's like, would the feedback be the part that's like that you're lying about, or like I think that there's probably like some, like, I think if you're lying about your own personal experiences, but I don't think therapists really talk about their own personal experiences, No. I mean, not usually, I don't think. And so I think it's tricky, because it's like, I think you would want to not lie, but I can't really think of an exact situation where like a huge lie would come up.
I guess I'm thinking about, like, let's say you have, I think the hard thing in the situation is like, how would a patient present something where it would make sense for you to lie? Like, where, like, let's say let's say a patient has a worry that they're like a shitty person or something, and like you're in cognitive behavioral therapy, so you're trying to basically, in a way, like hyper rationalize situations. And let's say you present a situation, but like you're trying to show them that like maybe they aren't a shitty person, but then they tell you something that they did, and you're like, wow, that's really shitty. And you're like, I guess maybe the therapist, and that's, I don't know, maybe the thing you would do is be like, yeah, that's probably kind of shitty, but that's like one thing. But then we're back at BoJack. the like good actions, bad actions. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it is a really interesting question, because I'm sure it comes up. I'm sure that there's situations where it's like, damn, I don't want to lie to this person, but like that's pretty shitty. Yeah. So like I'm sure that it is like an ethical dilemma that comes up in therapy. And I think it's probably, case to case. Like clearly you don't want to do a significant lie to where it's going to like, it could harm them, put them in harm's way.
Or make them a shitty person in that example.
Yeah, and I think that's a hard line. Is like, you don't necessarily want to be brutally honest. And like, I think a good example of like what I'm thinking through is like, I did this shitty thing. Like, you're not going to be like, yeah, that makes you a real shitty person. It's like, you're not going to do that. You could be like, yeah, like that was a shitty thing, but like that was in the past. I don't know what therapists would say, but it's like, in your head, you might be like, wow, this is a shitty person. But like as a therapist, you're like, they're here to work on themselves. They're not a shitty person. They're a person who needs help. And like, we're working forward to becoming a good person, And so like, those are the thoughts that would probably be going through your head as a therapist. But but you can probably recognizing like, yeah, that's a shitty thing, but let's move forward and like address it. And that type of stuff. I'd
be curious to hear if I should look into that after, because I want to figure out more on that. But
yeah, I'm curious too.
I think I kind of want to move into some more personal stuff. I have an important question, because I think you're definitely one of the most hardworking people I've seen, but I like, you've maybe had some various struggles with school and like trying to get into grad school, which is understandable. And a question that I have that I've asked myself in a lot of situations is, do you think that hard work pays off?
You know, that is a really good question. I that could bring into so many categories, like, you know, the American dream, or like, you know, like,
American dream pizza? What? No.
I think that hard work can pay off, and I think in a lot of situations it doesn't. I think that you can work really hard and not achieve a goal. But I think you can also work really hard and achieve a goal. I also think you can work really hard because you have to and not because you want to. Right. And so like there's a lot of different type of like work hard like situations that could be talked about here. But I don't know, like generally like me personally, like whenever I decide that I'm going to do something, if I decide it, like I'm going to do it, right? Like, you know, at some point once I decided to attend college, I was like, okay, I'm going to get a PhD. It was like, I'm either going to be a car mechanic or I'm going to get a PhD. Like there's no in between. Like, I don't know why. That was just like, like, actually I do. Like, I remember, you know, I kind of talked about, you know, not feeling super smart when I was younger. And at some point that was my reason for getting a PhD, which is not any now. And that's not healthy. Don't get a PhD just to feel smart. That's a stupid reason. But like, right. So it's like, I think as soon as I like set my head on something, it's just like there's no backing away from it. Like that is just what's going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
Like it's just, unless like there's just really no excuse, period. Like if I'm like, I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And in that case, I think hard work is worth it because I'm like, I know to get here, there's all these steps and I have to work hard to get through those steps. Right. But then in other situations, like I'm trying to think of a situation. I don't know. In other situations, applying to 100 jobs or I don't know, there's other things where just like maybe it wasn't worth it. Like maybe it was worth just spending more time and finding a better position. Or I don't really know what I'm getting at, but
I get you.
Yeah.
I think that the reason I ask is I feel like I've had various experiences in my life that made me feel like hard work doesn't pay off, but I think that a lot of that is more just me sort of feeding into idea. Like I maybe don't do exactly the same thing, but I tend to kind of be like, if I truly decide that I'm going to do something, I, in a lot of cases, will do it. Maybe not consistently necessarily, but I will go for certain things and at least attempt it. But I've found that what happens to me sometimes, if I get really stuck on one thing, I can sort of mess myself up, and my hard work is not being focused in the direction that I need to actually achieve the goal. So in a weird way, to me, it's like hard work sometimes takes some hard work to actually get yourself to be moving in the right direction. I think that's something I've struggled with, and I think it takes time and it's a difficult process to like recognize that. But like it happened to me with like applying to colleges and hoping to get these big scholarships and then like not necessarily getting what I wanted, and then realizing like, realizing maybe a year down the line in retrospect, I'm like, okay, the reason I didn't get those is probably not because I didn't work hard. It's because like I was spending all this time on like one thing in school that was like important. But if I had like, you know, the opportunity cost in economics, if I had just taken, if I had the opportunity cost of spending an extra 3 hours on this assignment versus even maybe losing a grade there, I could go work on this application and make this application a lot better. And so making those adjustments. And sometimes I think that's the thing is like it's not necessarily I can work really hard, but sometimes I can get stuck in the wrong spot because I'm hard-headed on something, or I guess like I think it's also hard when certain barriers come up, like with you and the GRE. That's not necessarily your style of how you do things, but I watched you like study for like 8 hours a day for like weeks on end, which I don't know how you were as successful as you were with that, but it's coming out the other end. That's something difficult if you don't get what you want. But
yeah. Yeah. No, I think that, like, particular with the GRE and talking about barriers, I think that in life, some people are going to just have things a little bit easier than other people. And that's just, that's the way that life is. And with the GRE, for instance, financially, the GRE is just horrible, period. Like, the GRE is just stupid.
Is it College Board that does that?
I have no idea who does it. Somebody.
I fucking hate the College Board.
Probably the College Board. Someone stupid.
They do the SAT and stuff.
Yeah, like the SAT is fucked. Like, okay, I think this, and I full-heartedly believe this. Like, same with the SAT. Like, the purpose is to do this for students who got really bad grades, so that they can prove to themselves that, like, oh look, I can work hard. I did good on this test, right? That's not what it's used for. Yeah. It's like, can you get X amount of like grades or X amount of questions right, to get into, whatever like school you want to go to.
Yeah.
And with the GRE, there's so many barriers. It's, number one, a huge financial barrier. People who have finances are able to set aside, get a tutor, not work for 6 months or not work at all, take the GRE. Number two, GRE is all based off of things that you did in high school, right? It's like math that you learned like freshman year of high school to senior year of high school. It does not represent anything that you learned in college, like the general GRE. It does not represent anything that you learned in college, which is stupid. I wasn't a good high school student. I had other priorities. I was working, right?
As I had most high school students do.
Yeah, it's just not something that like, I was horrible at math. I never liked math, but I love statistics, right? I'm in psychology. I love statistics.
Yeah.
And there's a tiny, tiny statistics section on it. So it's just like, it's not generalizable to like what you actually want to like go to grad school for, right?
Yeah.
And then, there's other disadvantages like, being first generation college student and not knowing that you have to take the GRE and then rushing and having to take the GRE and not having the time and then not getting the application cycle. I think that this can be said just about anything, with college as a whole, though. Like, there's just so many barriers within college that makes it extremely challenging. And it does seem like there's a lot of efforts being put out to address a lot of these barriers, which is good and needs to continue to happen. So
I guess so I feel like for me at least, like at some point doubts will start to creep in on certain things, and like there's certain ways I can push those off, but how do you deal with things when it feels like there's obstacles that can sometimes feel insurmountable? Like
philosophy
based. Nietzsche. Don't read Nietzsche, probably. I don't know. Maybe do read Nietzsche. But.
Yeah, like, I think, really taking it out of perspective of we live in a society.
Joker, baby.
we live in a society where there's these set expectations, right? There is this set expectation that you have to go, I don't know. Also, these set expectations were created by who, right? Random people like X amount of years ago. And then these expectations are set for our society to just like live off of, which is like crazy because there are so many different types of people and like, I don't know. Anyways.
Just different societies as well.
Yeah, exactly. But there's these expectations, right? Like you go high school, if you want to make money, which this isn't even necessarily the case at all. If you want to make money, you go to college, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the case, but you go to college. And if
learn to code.
Yeah, you learn to code. Graduate college, you get a job, right? And there's all these stepping stones, right? Like you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. And then there's this general idea, like if you don't do that in the order and in an efficient amount of time, then you're a failure. Or like, it's not even that you're a failure, but that's kind of just like the general vibe, the general feel, right? Somebody who's going to college when they're 30 might feel very uncomfortable because that is the vibe society gives off is like, oh, you're supposed to go when you're 18, which is, by the way, stupid. Nobody knows what they want to do with their life at 18 years old. Anyways, and so like there's just like, I think really just knowing like, oh, like I'm just existing in a world and I'm just doing the best I can, and it's going to take time, and like I might fail, and like I'll try to learn from my failures. I'll try my best to learn from my failures, but if I can't learn, then like, and if there's nothing to take from it, then that's also okay, which I think that was a really huge lesson to learn. It's like, I think everyone also pushes like, you know, failure is good. You always learn from your failures. Like, no, you don't. Like sometimes you fail and it was just like something went wrong. Like, yeah, it's just like, fuck. Like, and that's just the way it is. You don't always have to learn from every negative life lesson.
Yeah.
Which is something that I've recently, you know, honestly, that BoJack episode really hit me.
I should rewatch it.
Oh, it's
again.
so, yeah, it was a good episode. But like,
it's like my favorite show.
It's so good. Yeah. But like, you don't have to learn something from every failure, and that's okay. And I think it's also okay to just exist and do your best and set your own goals and go at your own pace and like do all these things that society might not deem acceptable, but fuck society. So like do it anyways, right? Like you just got to do what you got to do when you want to do it. Like number one, you just need like, and I'm going to stress this point again. Like I honestly think just like, you just need to find things that make you happy every day. Like if you're not doing things that make you happy every day, what is the point? Like actually like, if, like, if you're just miserable for 10 years while you go to grad school, what was the point?
Yeah.
Like the point, like if you're like, oh, I'm going to go to grad school, I'm going to get my degree and then I'm going to be happy. Like, no, like you won't. Like every single step in your life, like I'm going to buy a house. Like, okay, now you have a house. Now I'm going to have kids. And like nothing is ever going to truly make you happy. Yeah. Like it might be like, oh, yay. And then that high of being excited will go away. Right.
Yeah.
So like you just need to find those things every single day that is joy in your life, because you might die tomorrow, right? You know, it's just like, what is the point of existing if you're not going to find joy in life as it is right now? And so I think like that's really that, and that's a hard thing to remember. Like, and I think that's why I like love existentialism. I feel like that idea that's really what I take from it, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think like, it's so important. Like, yes, like things are hard, and, you know, I do work really hard, and sometimes it's really challenging, but remembering like that's okay. Like you might not have done what you needed to get done, but that's okay. You know?
Yeah.
Like you just gotta exist and be happy and like keep moving forward, even if it's slower than you want it to be, even if it's like not exactly the path that you wanted to go in, like just keep doing it. So, yeah.
I think the doing your best thing, that's something I had a thought on. Mm-hmm. I don't remember when, but just the idea of doing your best is a bit perplexing to me sometimes, because mm-hmm. in a way, I don't know if I'm doing like weird philosophical circles today, but in a way, whatever it is that you did kind of is your best, unless you're like purposefully self-sabotaging. It's like, let's say you wanted to finish your essay today and you maybe wrote like a paragraph. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, it's kind of what you did. That was kind of the best that was going to come out of that scenario. And maybe I'm diving into the everything happens for a reason again, but mm-hmm. it's I think what is your best is kind of such a confusing situation. Like I think, so I'm always struggling with having done enough. Like I never know what enough means in a way. And that's something that I don't really think there is a good answer to that. But I think sometimes I will get caught up in watching what other people have created and I will compare myself. But then there's a weird situation where that will drive me to do things myself. But I think it's sometimes it's weird, because even just being happy every day doesn't feel like enough. I think that's where I kind of fall back into philosophy that like I can't maintain. There's like, I guess some people could look at that. I don't think this is necessarily what you're saying, but some people talk about like the hedonic treadmill and doing just always searching for the next thing. But there's even perspectives on hedonism that are more interesting than just the hedonic treadmill, and talking about how having, being in a situation where it's not so much about finding the next thing that's going to like give you dopamine or happiness. It's, the perspective that I've heard is, reducing suffering rather, and finding ways to reduce your suffering, and whether that be through pleasurable actions or through some sort of philosophical thing that you come up with, I think, or just telling yourself that you've done enough on something, or that I think that's something that's super hard, is like you never want to give up on a goal, but there's times when it's best to shift to something else. But then, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really cool point. I think that, yeah, doing your best is a very like vague statement, right? Because doing your best one day might be doing your best completely different. Like doing your best one day, it can be like getting out of bed, when another day it's like writing a book, you know? Yeah. And so like that's hard to like calculate. And I notice I do that, like, especially when I go to the gym, I'm so like, I am so much like, I'm going to do all or nothing. Like I have to like, if I'm, for example, like right now I'm doing strength training in my left arm because I had a surgery in my right arm, or my right wrist. And then I'm like, okay, I have to implement cardio. And then I'm like, okay, well, I have to do cardio, right? Like what am I going to do? And I'm like, well, I'll bike. That sounds horrible, indoor biking. And so I tried it and I realized like, I am so bad at just biking. I'm just going to bike for 30 minutes. Like, no, like I have to like make a plan. Like I'm going to bike 100 miles, or like, you know, it's like, I want this like very strict, I have to like make a goal and make this training plan and like do this whole thing. It's like, I can't just casually do cardio. It's like, I have to do this full elaborate, like I'm going to train so that I can do this and that. And then it's like, okay, but that's too much. Right. And so then it's just like, how do you just, because then it's like, you won't stick to that workout plan, right? Like I know, like I'm already strength training, like that's my priority. And then I'm like, I'm going to casually do cardio, but I'm not going to, because there's no way I can just casually do cardio, right? Like I have to have a goal, or else it's unenjoyable. And so then it's like, what is your best there? Like what is enough? What's too much? What's like, where are you going to find your goals? And like, how do you determine those things? And then, so I think that's a really, really tricky question to look at.
I don't know.
Yeah, me either.
I think that's probably a good place to stop. Everyone do your best.
Whatever that means.
Well, thanks for coming on, Jess. I really appreciate it. Hope everyone enjoys, and we'll hopefully be back next month as well. I'll figure everything out. But yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.